Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Rappahannock in Whitestone, Virginia. Today is Sunday, June 6, 2021. My name is Susan Mosley. I'm the minister here at UUFR, and it is my privilege to be your service leader for this video service. UUFR is a caring community whose mission is to put UU principles into practice through programs that empower spiritual exploration, critical thinking, and social service, and also to provide a spiritual home for future generations. Our speaker this morning is Eddie Correia, beloved member of UUFR and someone who has spoken for us on many occasions. Today's topic is the Enlightenment, and it is part 2 of a four-part series on religion and the irrational. I will say more about Eddie a little bit later in the service. I want to take a moment of personal privilege right now, because this is probably the last video service that we will be doing once a month, like that we have done throughout the pandemic. We've had one video service a month, first Sunday of the month, through the pandemic, and the only reason we were able to do that was because of the gift of time and creative energy from Hank Stupai. I want to say a special word of appreciation for his creativity and the time that he has put into these services. They have been a real gift to us and the larger community. So thank you, Hank. And thank you, Hank and Nancy together, for the music that they have provided for these services. They've also searched and chosen other musical pieces that have been inserted, which are also wonderful. But for everyone at UUFR, seeing Hank and Nancy singing together is a real treat, because they always provided music for us when we were in the sanctuary together before the pandemic. So thank you again, Hank and Nancy, for making these videos possible.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of living, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come, 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 whoever you are, condemned, worshipper, lover of living, ours is no worshipper, lover is living, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, whoever you are, condemned, worshipper, lover of living, ours is no worshipper, lover is living. Come yet again, come.
As we light the chalice this morning, may our souls become its hearth. A chalice in our midst is a symbol of our liberal faith. It's a faith built on the foundation of freedom, reason, and tolerance. It's a faith sustained by acts of kindness and justice. A faith that visions a world flourishing with equality for all her people. It's a faith that demands living out of goodness. It requires thoughtfulness. It's a faith of wholeness. This tiny flame is the symbol of the spark of all this within each of us. Our opening words this morning are from William Ellery Channing. He was a great Unitarian preacher and theologian in the early 19th century. Listen to his words about religious instruction. The great end in religious instruction is not to stamp our minds upon the young, but to stir up their own. Not to make them see with our eyes, but to look inquiringly and steadily with their own. Not to give them a definite amount of knowledge, but to inspire a fervent love of truth. The great end in religious instruction is not to bind them by this is a hard word to pronounce, ineradicable prejudices. Let me start that sentence again. The great end in religious instruction is not to bind them by ineradicable prejudices, but to prepare them for impartial, conscientious judging of whatever subjects may be offered to their decision. Not to burden the memory, but to quicken and strengthen the power of thought. The great end in religious instruction is not to impose religion upon them in the form of arbitrary rules, but to awaken the conscience, the moral discernment. In a word, the great end is to awaken the soul to excite and cherish spiritual life. In religious community, we share our joys and our triumphs, our sorrows and our broken places. We hold space for the complexity of life and the myriad experiences that bless and break our hearts. The truth of human experience is that on any given day, we each come to the table with hearts in different places. In our sanctuary, we have a water chalice that symbolizes the community that holds us, and small pieces of sea glass to place in the water to represent each joy or concern shared. Since we are not physically together today, I offer this virtual ritual. This piece of sea glass is for all those worries that we cannot share out loud today, and for the disappointments and sorrows that we carry in our hearts. This piece of glass is for all the people and experiences and natural wonders that fill our lives with joy. May we hold each other in our hearts today and every day.
Later this morning, I'm going to talk about the Enlightenment and the effect that the Enlightenment had on people's belief in religion and how religion fared under the Enlightenment. I'm going to talk about four Enlightenment thinkers, including Voltaire, a famous French writer. And the reading this morning is from Voltaire. So let me first give you a description by a historian about Voltaire, and then I'll read an excerpt of a poem from Voltaire. Voltaire was not an atheist, in part because he thought that some minimal belief in a deity was useful for social cohesion. Voltaire's God created the world, instilled in us a sense of good and evil, and then basically took a back seat. This is rational religion, known in the 18th century under the name of natural religion or deism, and it has no truck with metaphysics of any kind. Voltaire was a man of reason who loathed fanaticism, idolatry, and superstition. That men can kill each other to defend some bit of religious doctrine which they scarcely understand is something he found repellent. And he reserved his greatest hatred for the clerics who exploited the credulity of believers to maintain their own power base. Voltaire wanted religion without the church. And here's the excerpt of his poem written in 1768. Now, when he refers to my lodging in the first line, he's talking about the world. My lodging is filled with lizards and rats, but the architect exists, and anyone who denies it is touched with madness under the guise of wisdom. Consult Zoroaster and Minos and Solon and the martyr Socrates and the great Cicero. They all adored a master, a judge, a father. This sublime system is necessary to man. It is the sacred tie that binds society, the first foundation of holy equity, the bridle to the wicked, the hope of the just. If the heavens, stripped of his noble imprint, could ever cease to attest to his being, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him.
Dona nobis pacem, pacem. Dona nobis 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 pacem, pacem. Dona
no motion, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean. Still my dry land heart can say, I've been sailing all my life now. Never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue gold home. Sun, my sail, and moon, my rudder, as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the lights of the heavens in our beautiful blue road home. I give thanks to the waves upholding me, hail the great winds urging me on, greet the infinite sea before me, sing the sky that sailor's song. I was born upon the fathoms, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home. La 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 la.
Each time we gather for worship, we take an offering to support this fellowship's programs and ministries of justice and compassion. Our offering is an affirmation, a yes. When we give, we say yes to what we value. Let us now make our offering with love, generosity, and gratitude. And please know that your gifts are gratefully received, and we strive always to be good stewards of those gifts. It's my privilege to introduce you now to our speaker for this morning, Eddie Correia. Most of you know Eddie very well and have heard him speak many times. But if you're just now tuning into our video services and hearing Eddie for the first time, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about him. Eddie is a Washington, D.C. attorney and an adjunct professor at American University's Law School. Eddie was chief counsel of the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee and served in the Clinton administration as special counsel to the President for Civil Rights. Eddie is a member of the board of directors of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. and he has written several books, including 2 novels. So check out his books. I'm delighted to welcome Eddie now to speak to us about the Enlightenment, which is part 2 of a 4-part series he is doing for us on religion and the irrational. Welcome, Eddie.
I'm going to talk this morning about why people believe in the irrational. This is the part 2 of a 4-part series. The first 2 parts have to do with whether traditional religion is irrational. And last time in that first talk, I suggested that traditional beliefs, it's hard to justify them based on reason, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Hinduism, other religions. Now, one could justify them based on faith, but it's hard to base them on traditional concepts of reason. And that goes for the existence of a personal God, the existence of heaven and hell, the virgin birth, a lot of things that we learned when we were young. But that's not the end of the story. First of all, you could believe those things based on faith. And also, there's the issue of meaning, finding meaning, whether you believe them or not. Let's begin this way. Let me give you a very oversimplified version of the intellectual history of the human race. Our ancestors were very primitive. Let's say Homo sapiens emerged 200,000 years ago or so. No doubt they were very superstitious. They had no conception of science. They were able to make tools and use them, but they couldn't solve complex problems. If we were able to time travel and went back and saw them, they'd probably either run away or kill us. Probably wouldn't be a very pleasant meeting. Language probably emerged 150,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. We don't really know. Writing did not emerge until 3000 BCE in Sumeria, about the same time in Egypt. It took another 2,000 years or so for an explosion of intellectual growth in the Mediterranean, particularly in Greece. Now, why did that happen? Why was there such an amazing explosion of intellectual thought? Probably because the Mediterranean was a place of trade and interchange of cultures. That always typically promotes growth of ideas. And the early Greeks developed our original conceptions of logic and philosophy. Reached its peaks with Plato and Aristotle, but even before then, there were some really amazing insights. Thales in the 7th century concluded that this ancient gods really couldn't control events. There must be some underlying phenomenon that was controlling them. Xenophanes, this is right around 500 BCE, had the insight that our view of gods really depends on our culture. Let me just read something he said. The Ethiopians made their gods black and snub-nosed. The Thracians say theirs have blue eyes and red hair. If oxen and horses had hands and could paint, oxen would no doubt paint their gods like oxen, and horses would paint them like horses. Pretty amazing modern sounding insights. The Greeks had no microscopes, no telescopes, no conception of basic chemistry, no understanding of molecules and atoms, no understanding of evolution. But they had the right mindset. You know, the mindset to try to understand the world based on reason rather than just superstition or what the priest told them. Given time and the right circumstances, you know, a much more modern view of the world might have emerged. But beginning in, let's say the 4th or 5th century, the church became the dominant intellectual force in Europe. And the church traditionally has stood in the way of science. They objected to Copernicus's idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. They insisted all the planets and stars must revolve around the Earth. They insisted that orbits must be perfectly circular because that seemed to be divinely inspired. When Galileo used his telescope, which he perfected or certainly improved, about insights consistent with Copernicus' perception, they put him on trial. So the underlying idea was that the church leaders said, don't question religious authority. Certainly don't go out and use your rationality and reason to discover what the world is like. Now, that period of church domination of intellectual thought probably lasted from, let's say, 4th or 5th century to, we talked about Aquinas last time, to after Aquinas. People call that the Middle Ages, sometimes call it the Dark Ages, but anyway, there's a long period of domination of intellectual thought by the church. But beginning with, let's say, the 14th century, there was really another explosion of intellectual developments, several overlapping developments. The Renaissance, let's say we could date that from 14th century. Florence, willingness to really radically change the tradition in art, to portray the human body in its natural form, to consider people more as individuals rather than just a member of a flock of a church. The Reformation, of course, we date that from 1517 when Martin Luther posted his theses on the cathedral door. The scientific method, we could date that from Copernicus, or we could date it from Isaac Newton, let's say, his Principia major work in 1687. And then the Enlightenment, which in a way drew together a lot of strands of intellectual thought. We could date that, let's say, from Descartes in the 17th century. I'll talk a little bit about Descartes in a moment. Now, these were the really very dramatic intellectual developments. They set the stage for the modern world. They set the stage for science to be our dominant intellectual force rather than the church. Now, one might have expected that traditional religion might have died away, or at least been significantly reduced in importance. One might have thought all these Enlightenment thinkers might have concluded, let's use our rationality in this area of religion. This idea of a personal God that controls the universe just doesn't make much sense from a scientific basis. But that's not the way it happened. And I want to talk about why probably that did not happen. If you want to get an idea of what that would have looked like if it did happen, or at least one version of it, it's consider the French Revolution and the years right after the French Revolution, where many of the cathedrals in France were referred to as temples of reason. Even Notre Dame, in 1793, there was a festival of reason at Notre Dame where the nave was decorated with an artificial mountain with bust of Plato and Aristotle. Over the top, yes, but everything about the French Revolution and the period after the French Revolution was over the top. We haven't really gone back there since, but that would be one example, maybe an extreme example of throwing religion overboard. But very few people were willing to do that. Very few people would consider themselves atheist. Now, why were these great minds of the Enlightenment so intent on saving the idea of a personal God? I want to mention 4 great thinkers. The reading was Voltaire, Descartes and Locke, and then Immanuel Kant. All of them had some notion and wrote about the existence of God and morality. Each of them had his own views, and I'll briefly talk about them. I think, to summarize, there are really 2 factors that kept religion intact. The cosmology problem and what we might call the morality problem. The cosmology problem is this: how did the universe come to exist? Probably biggest reason today people believe in God, I would guess, because it's really hard to imagine how the universe could come into existence without some powerful God. Not just the vast universe, but flowers and one-celled organisms. I mean, everything about nature is incredibly complex and incredibly wonderful. Very hard to imagine that could have all happened without God. At least people have a hard time with that. That led to, I talked about this last time, the first cause argument, something Aquinas argued in the 13th century in his justification or reasons for the existence of God. Started with Aristotle. Aquinas, a big fan of Aristotle. Aristotle talked about the first mover, really a similar idea. As I talked about last time, let's say everything does have a cause. One could argue back and forth on that, but let's say one accepts that. Then why would that cause be a personal God, the God of the Bible? Maybe it's some singularity in the universe, some natural phenomenon that is the cause. Now, a lot of people were driven to the deist position. I mentioned deism earlier. The idea that, yes, there was a divine force, there was a God that created the universe, but that divine force has really left the universe or has really stepped aside. That's the traditional deist position. A lot of founders of our country were probably deists. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, perhaps. The idea that God is just no longer around, doesn't take an active involvement, is not actively involved in the world. Elvis has left the building. Voltaire was probably a deist. Now, how would Voltaire get the position that there was a God in the first place? Well, he accepted what is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument goes like this. Imagine there's a perfect being. One attribute of perfection is existence. Therefore, God exists. Something a little fishy about that? Do you think that's a little bit of sleight of hand? Well, it is kind of sleight of hand. What it's doing is combining two attributes, existence and perfection, really together. And essentially it's equivalent to a claim that a perfect being exists. Not too persuasive. Kant thought that was a phony argument, thought it was sleight of hand. He made an argument based on morality, which ironically is somewhat similar. The idea is it is necessary that a kingdom of God will come to exist someday, an ideal world where people love each other. And if such a world is inevitable and a certainty, then God must be a certainty too. Again, I'd say it's unpersuasive for the same reasons. Now, you might have thought John Locke, remember John Locke, the great empiricist, the originator of the phrase, tabula rasa, our mind is a blank slate. Everything we know must be based on empirical evidence. You would have thought that Locke, of all the people, would say, well, I'm going to give up on the idea of a personal God because I just don't see the scientific evidence. And in fact, Locke was rather conflicted about that. A couple of sentences by Locke that show his maybe internal conflict. One is to say that bare testimony of revelation is the highest certainty. But then elsewhere he says, revelation must be judged by reason. Maybe he was torn himself. Now, none of the positions of these Enlightenment thinkers on this, I think, are particularly persuasive, but we have to understand how the knowledge they had about the world. They didn't know anything about quantum physics. They didn't know anything about subatomic particles. They had no knowledge of the Big Bang or the vastness of the universe. This was long before Darwin. They knew nothing of natural selection or evolution. So they didn't really have a basis for conceiving how the universe could come to exist without a personal God. Now, we do today. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, but they did not. The morality problem is basically this, that people are terrified about the idea that What would happen to morality if there was no God? Because God functions as a constraint on human behavior. There's a passage in the Brothers Karamazov, the Dostoevsky novel, where one of the brothers, Ivan, says, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. And I read the passage from Voltaire, who said, really, because of the fear of no constraints on human behavior, if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now, is that very persuasive? Well, I don't think so. We all know people who are very moral and are not particularly religious. In fact, one might say some very religious people, they don't seem to care much about the poor based on their voting patterns. You know, you might say, gee, that certainly doesn't guarantee morality if you're very religious. So the arguments of these great Enlightenment thinkers, the best minds of the day, were not particularly persuasive, but they still clung to the idea of a traditional, personal God. And therefore, after the Enlightenment, when you might suspect the Enlightenment would have undermined religion, and religion emerged pretty much intact after the Enlightenment. On the other hand, the Enlightenment allowed us to escape the domination of the church of intellectual thought. So when we emerged after the Enlightenment, the church was no longer the dominant intellectual force. Science was, and science continues to be to this day. Now, where does this all take us? Well, many people probably still today have the cosmology problem and the morality problem, in the sense that they can't conceive of how the universe would exist without a personal God. And maybe they are afraid that if there is no God of the Bible, that morality will collapse. So what are our options? I talked about this a little bit last time. One option is to say that I don't care about rationality. I don't care about improving propositions, particularly religious beliefs, by reason. I'm going to have faith and continue to believe in the traditional God. Very respectable position, and millions of people around the world have it, maybe most people in the world. Part of that thinking may be that it's just too complicated. The human mind can't really understand the universe. I read a quote from Einstein last time where, let me just quote a sentence of it. The human mind, no matter how highly trained, cannot grasp the universe. Well, I'm not sure he would say that today. That was 90 years ago or so. The idea of the Big Bang, when Einstein lived, it was kicked around, but there was really no proof for it. That didn't come until 1965, when the background cosmic radiation from the beginnings of the universe was detected. That really tended to confirm the idea of the Big Bang. The reality is we are getting closer and closer to understanding at least the creation of the universe. So it makes the option of just saying the universe is too difficult to understand, I think, a little more difficult. Another option is to say, I don't care about religion at all. I'm doing quite well, thank you. Certainly a lot of people would take that position. Third path is to say, no, I'm going to have religious beliefs. I'm going to develop my own religious beliefs. And I have a conception of a higher power, perhaps, or I'm going to radically change my conception of God, or maybe I'm not going to use God language at all. My position, which I'm not trying to convince you of, is that I do use God language to refer to the spirit of love in the universe, but to me that's an internal spirit, not something external to us. It's a spirit that's carried in the consciousness of society from generation to generation. Whichever option we take, we still have the meaning, what I would call the meaning problem. Where do we find meaning? You know, that's really the challenge of the existentialist. I remember one of the phrases of the existentialist was, Essence does not precede existence. Essence meaning the purpose of life. Existence precedes essence. In other words, we come into the world without a purpose, and we have to find it on our own. That's a challenge posed by the existentialist, and I think if one says, I'm going to base my beliefs based on reason, then that you have to face that challenge as well. Let me close with a quote from Paul Tillich. Tillich, you probably heard of him, famous theologian born in Germany, came to the United States, taught at Columbia and at Harvard. Most famous book, The Courage to Be. Tillich says the following: there are no valid arguments for the existence of God, but there are acts of courage in which we affirm the power of being. Now, he used the phrase, the power of being. I'm going to loosely substitute for that the meaning of life rather than the power of being. Then the last line of his book is, again, The Courage to Be, is this: the courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. In other words, if the traditional God disappears, some other idea of God emerges. So even if you don't accept Tillich's formulation, I think his basic point must be right. It takes courage to face the human condition. It takes the courage to face our own death. And it takes courage particularly to do that if we say we're going to cling to our rationality and science. But if we can do that, we do find meaning. Thank you.
Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say it's all right. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Little darling, it feels like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. It's all right.
Little darling, the smiles returning to their faces. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. It's all right.
Sun, 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 here it comes. 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 Little darling, I feel that ice is slowly melting. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun, and I say it's all right. It's all right.
We extinguish our chalice flame, daring to carry forward the vision of this free faith, that freedom, reason, and justice will one day prevail in this nation and across the earth. May the love which overcomes all differences, which reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and forever. May it be so, and namaste.